All right, so this Kabbalah Explained Simply is going to be about the Star of David, and we're going to discuss the roots of this ancient symbol and where does it stem from. Um, Possibly it's a shield. We know that King David, whom it's ascribed to, was always embroiled in battles. And he lived in a very warlike time, and this symbol may have had something to do with the way that they defended themselves, or it could have a deeper meaning, or as is often the case in the wisdom of Kabbalah, there's two opposites that are inhering at the same time. Like everything in reality is composed of opposites, right? In our body, our atoms have both negative and positive charges. In molecules, it's the same thing. And really, in anything that is true, which extends to the conceptual sphere, that is supposed to be, if it's not just philosophy, if it's really about reality, then also in the conceptual sphere, there should be opposites. We're not used to this. We hate it. We can't stand it. We're used to things being divided into different camps and being factionalized and people being atomized into their different views. But the truth always turns out to be a conglomerate, an integration of opposite factors that, though they are totally contradictory, turn out to have a meeting point in which something new is created precisely out of these opposites. Just like the opposite particles or molecules in our body ultimately give rise to you, give you the ability to listen to this. Had those particles not been able to come together in some opposite way through some gravitational pull, some force that came between them and united them, then you wouldn't exist. You wouldn't be able to hear this broadcast. And I say that because, as usually is the case, there turn out to be these opposites in the wisdom of Kabbalah. And people aren't used to that. They're not used to being able to do what I think Socrates or Aristotle said, that the sign of an educated mind is to be able to tolerate two opposing ideas at the same time. And so we need to, even if we hear these things discreetly and address them one at a time, we need to understand that probably they combine in some strange way, out of which something new is born. So let's start with the psalm from the first time that this maybe shield is mentioned, which is Psalm 18, where the writer says, who's supposed to be King David, but the writer says, "You have given me the shield of your salvation. Your right hand has supported me, and your humility has made me great." Okay, so he mentions a shield. He didn't say that it's a hexagram. He didn't describe it. He just said he has a shield. And we know that most of the Psalms, or a lot of them, have to do with war. So there's always battle elements being discussed. And so I don't know how significant it is that he's mentioning this shield, except that we also have strange, mysterious texts that come along afterwards, such as this one, which scholars now, I'll tell you later if I agree with this or not, if Kabbalah agrees with this, but scholars ascribe this to someone in the 13th century, a little known person who they think was a Kabbalist or a mystic or whatever. And here in this text, which is actually ascribed to Adam HaRishon, so a much older person by Kabbalists, but let's say that this came about in the 13th century, in medieval times. And here we have this hexagram, this star, that would later be ascribed to David, King David, and called the Star of David. Well, the interesting thing is that while this star has come to prominence and been associated with the Jews, not so much with Kabbalah, because nobody really knows what it actually means or if it has any connection to Kabbalah, but it's been associated with the Jews very, very strongly. However, scholars say who study these things and study the archaeological evidence say that this doesn't belong to the Jews at all. This actually belongs to the Hindus. The Hindus arrived at it first. They used it as part of their religion and their culture, and only later it was adopted by the Jews. Kabbalists would say, and we'll maybe do a Kabbalah Explained Simply in the future, where we look at how certain books are ascribed to ancient Kabbalists, but then scholars think they find evidence that they're, someone much, much later, such as this one, that wasn't written 5,000 years ago, but was written only 1300, in the year 1300 or so. So that's fine. For the sake of this podcast right now, let's just say we're going with the scholars, and this is from the 1300s. Okay. Why, though, did it get ascribed to David, and why only gradually? Because 1300s, Judaism had been around a long time, and they weren't using this star at all. In fact, this text is a very rare text that really wasn't studied at all. It's very strange, hard to understand. No one really knows what it means. So this is one of the first places that we see the Star of David at all in any way associated with any Jew or Judaism or anything, okay, other than the Hindus. So as far as scholarship is concerned, it belongs really to the Hindus and not the Jews. The Jews just took it and started using it in Judaism. Also in a mysterious, kind of unknown, really way. What does it really mean? There's lots of speculation. So I'm going to call this next segment Popular Guesses about the star's origins. And I'll just run through them really quickly. Related to the number 7. I mean, you can look at this star and find all kinds of numbers in there, right? You can count the points, you can count or not count the 2 triangles. So 7 is one of them, related to the menorah, but that's a little fishy, right? Because Hindus came up with it first, and it was only later ascribed to the Jews. In fact, scholars think that it came about in Hindu culture well before there was such a thing as a menorah. So that's a little suspicious. Shows the 6 directions of space. Okay. 6 Sefirot of Zeranpin. Zeranpin is one of the Sefirot in Kabbalah, which if you study, you probably know. Out of the 10 Sefirot, there's one Sefirah that has 6 called Zeranpin. Or the 7 Sefirot of Nukva, maybe 2 tribes, one for each triangle. So one for the tribe of Judah and one for the tribe of Benjamin. These are popular guesses. These are not what Kabbalah says. And as you can see, you can go 6 Sefirot, 7 Sefirot. If you take the 10 Sefirot, you can really ascribe any number you want because there are many, many different symbols. If you have 4 Sefirot, it's a square. If it's 3 Sefirot, it's a triangle. If it's 5 Sefirot, it could be the representation of the entire 10 Sefirot because you don't count Zeranpin. And you can, so any number you can find some mystical symbol in it. But is it true? Just because you're making those connections, it doesn't make it true. Okay, so these are just the guesses, and I'm not sure. We'll see. Okay, so historical moments in the star's adoption. Let's look at how it actually came to be ascribed to Judaism, since that's how we know it today. In 1354, the king of Bohemia, Charles IV, approved the Jews of Prague a red flag with the hexagram. Okay, that's the first we really know about it being associated with the Jews. In 1460, the Jews of Ofen received King Matthias's red flag on which 2 shields of David were. In the first Hebrew prayer book, printed in Prague in 1512, a large hexagram appears on the cover. And it's written there, each man beneath his flag, according to the house of their fathers, and he will merit to bestow a bountiful gift on anyone who grasps the shield of David. Okay, so now it's being called the shield of David. In 1592, Mordechai Mazel was allowed to affix a flag of David similar to that located on the main synagogue, on his synagogue in Prague. Okay. Following the Battle of Prague in 1648, the Jews were again granted a flag in recognition of their contribution to the city's defense. That flag showed a yellow hexagram on a red background. Okay, and then of course it was used as, these are renderings of the initial flag of Israel, so then it became really, really prominent. In Jewish culture. So then the question is still, is there a deeper meaning to this flag? I mean, it does seem like it really was adopted and, you know, maybe then later ascribed to King David. That's really what the evidence shows. And of course, if I was a rational scholar, that's what I would conclude, just looking at the historical evidence. So it's hard to say all of the historical evidence is wrong, and we won't do that. We'll just say that maybe there's an element of truth to it. But let's go to the Zohar. This is a book composed 2,000 years ago, and which, of course, scholars think that it was composed in the 1300s. There are certain reasons why scholars are inclined to ascribe things in Kabbalah to that time, because they've reached the conclusion based on their evidence, and their evidence is things like, if you look at the Zohar closely, then it looks like the description of Spain at that time. And so we think that it was written in medieval times in Spain. And there happened to be the emergence of a book of Zohar in Spain around that time. So the fact that the first Zohar that we know about emerged in Spain at that time, and it seems to their minds that in the Zohar, it's describing a landscape that's similar to Spain. So then they think that it was written in Spain at that time. But Kabbalists say that's not the case. Even if that was the case, let's take a look at what the Zohar says about King David. A throne of 3 pillars, what is each of them? There is a reason why David said that he is the 4th pillar of the throne. As it is written, the stone which the builders rejected. By that he implies to the 3 pillars that precede David. Hagat. These are Sefirot, Hesed, Givorah, Tiferet. Where did the builders reject David? As it is written, the stone which the builders rejected. Here's another. David is a tie of the tefillin of the Creator, the nukva of Zeranpin. Certainly the letter Daled of Yehuda. Yehuda is King David, and this is why David was tied to his holy name, since in the name of Yehuda there is Havayah, which is Zeranpin, and there is Dalet, which is King David, the nukva of Zeranpin. So why am I reading this mysterious text from the Zohar? This is to show, so this is something that Bala Sulam, the great Kabbalist of the 20th century, who attained all the spiritual worlds, so he took the book of Zohar and he added in a commentary. What part he added in was the words of the Sefirot, so the things like Nukva, Zeranpin, Dalet, well, the Havaya, probably not. That's already there. And then Zeranpin, Daled, Nukva. So these things are added in. Why? Because before, readers would have thought that this text was talking about ancient times. They would have thought it's talking about some king that happened to be in Israel's history. And the reason why he intersperses a commentary here with explanations of the terms is to show us that it's really talking about not our world, but the only thing that there is to talk about, which is the spiritual world, which stands behind our reality, which is what we're working through our reality to get to. That's the real reason I have a job that I have to go to. I have wife, kids, husband, family, whatever it is. I'm in all of that because I need to reach all of the spiritual world. And so if somebody writes to us from the spiritual world, the only thing that they could be writing about is the spiritual world. And they might use certain languages to refer to the forces in the spiritual world because there's a root and branch relationship. In this case, they're talking about a force called David. Now, this is a force that exists above space and time, and that's why if you access this spiritual world, which I think Plato later wrote about something like this because he was able to talk to people who talked to Kabbalists and came up with this idea. But there is this upper reality that exists and is unchanging. This is called in Kabbalah, I, the Lord, do not change. The Creator doesn't change. The upper world is there in perfection, waiting for us to be discovered, And everything along the way are just the phases that we uncover as I change, and thus I start seeing reality differently until enough internal revolutions take place to where kaleidoscopes together before me in all of my senses that I'm feeling this world with, kaleidoscopes together this picture of the eternal upper world, wherein you have things like something called King David, but it's not a man in our world. Right now, I'm this body. It's not the real me. It's, a more advanced monkey that just talks, and that's the only way in which I'm unique. But this is not really the real me. There's something deeper and more eternal. And so Kabbalists would never talk about someone like me. They would only talk about the force in the upper world to which I correspond and by which I appear in this world. Similarly with King David, it's talking not about a man, though such a man could also make an appearance in our world because every root in that upper world appears in our world in some way, maybe not how we imagine it, but appears in some way because really we're in the upper world already and we just see a shattered picture of it. So it appears in all kinds of events and ways. And so you have a branch, broken as it is, that appears before you in our world. And it can be divided across time and space as well. So in the same way that all the people are spread across the world and the planets across the universe, so too, part of this picture is divided across time. So it's divided across space in our perception right now and divided across time as well. This seems like very strange to us, but not really to physicists, by the way, because everyone will tell you that time just drops out of any equation that you try to use to explain the universe. Time is like, how do we explain that? Because it doesn't seem to exist. Well, Kabbalists say that that's true too. So this picture is divided across space, in which you might then have, at a certain time, the emergence of someone named David, but that's not really what Kabbalists are writing about. And that's not what they're writing about here. So they're talking about forces, one of which is David. They could have also just called it force number 4. But that wouldn't give us anything to tie our hearts to so that we could actually engage in this. A more effective way is to develop languages that are close to our hearts, because we live in this world, have language, are affected by it, can feel using our minds things that we can't necessarily feel right now, but could come to feel. So if I tell you my Yemenite grandmother used to cook this phenomenal soup with saffron, beef, onions, garlic, you can't taste the synergy of it. And, well, I don't want to confuse you by saying the love that went into it, but you can start imagining the ingredients and coming closer to a feeling of what it is. And in Kabbalah, when we start coming closer to the things, it's not just some imaginary concoction that I decided to create there. Like my Yemenite grandmother may have, put a dash of this and a dash of that. Here, we're talking about the recipe for the true reality that we're already in but don't feel and can come closer and closer to. Like my favorite example, when your leg is asleep, you can start to feel it again. Maybe it was totally numb and you could have pricked and not even felt it. You could get all the way to where it's completely numb and they can do a surgery on you. But if you move your leg a little bit, you can start to feel that you have a leg there, and whoa, you can even use it. You could even walk with this leg. And similarly to here, in the spiritual world, are pieces of you, parts of you, a more expansive you that actually has feeling, can sense. Like in the womb, your senses were gradually formed, and only then from within the womb, you started feeling, though you don't remember it, that there's a world outside. You don't know what a world is, but you start feeling that beyond the black, beyond the darkness, this black bubble in which you were born, there's some voices and some music, and really you start sensing it all through your mom. And so you can start feeling the spiritual world this way. This is actually how Kabbalah works. It can be explained more and more scientifically, how just by hearing about these things, and this is what Bala Sulam writes in item 155 of his introduction to the study of the 10 Sefirot, he says that even just mentioning the names of your soul, which are the least familiar things to us right now, but they're the most close to us, the most dear, like your family is probably, your little children. They're like the most dear, your spouse. They're the closest things to you other than yourself. These things are closer than yourself that Kabbalists speak about. But look how foreign they look. And this is how aloof we are from the true reality, that these things, David is a tie of the tefillin of the Creator, the nukva of Zeranpin, the letter Daled of Yehuda is the king. They're so unfamiliar that I start imagining there's some Jewish history and not related to me. We're kind of like in a situation where, imagine you really love your father and God forbid he goes through a stroke and he's sitting in bed there and he can't remember anybody. And he has to be awakened. So maybe you start bringing him family photos and he's like, oh, what a cute little family, but he doesn't identify them as being him at all and, related to him. And so then you take him out of the hospital and you start taking him to all kinds of places that he took you when you grew up, special places, like I went to Santa Cruz with my dad as a child. That was like our special place. So I take him to Santa Cruz. And, I can't hit him point blank with, "You're my dad," and just shake him. So I take him to these places, and gradually it awakens through all kinds of surrounding stimuli the fact that I'm his son, and it starts flooding back to him. So in this way, we need to flood back to us the feeling of the spiritual world that isn't this crummy hospital bed that I'm in. It may seem like a nice hospital, but it's not actually the real reality. It's a simulated, they got a TV there for me. They bring me meals. The nurse tends to me, but this place is only supposed to rehabilitate me. And similarly with our world, it's only supposed to rehabilitate us. It's not the main thing that in this hospital there's something to do and something to discover there, like everybody thinks that it's all about our culture and our science and let's discover this and that and do these economics and those politics. We're not actually here for that. There's nothing to do in this hospital except to reawaken the true reality. Then I take my dear old dad out of this hospital into the real world, and he remembers there's a real world. And then I start taking him to these fun places, and he gets connected again to his family. His heart opens up to us, and we're back to one big happy family. And this way too, we need to break out of this shell that we're in, this, apple pit, this dark apple pit that the worm is stuck inside of, and burst out into the true world, the spiritual world. So all of that to say that the Sefirot might stand behind the Star of David. They might stand behind it because, again, there is nothing else to talk about in reality. There's the 10 Sefirot, and then how I perceive them in a way that I'm no longer feeling myself in Sefirot whatsoever. I just see this shattered world because these sapphires, if you want, these sapphires is the analogy that's used. They broke apart, and now they show me this useless shattered glass. But if we want to talk about the truth, what it really exists, and not just philosophize about history like the scholars do, then we need to know that it's probably really about the Sefirot, and any historical explanations are just incidental to that. So we have these Sefirot, they're all in Hebrew here, but we have Keter, Chokmah, Bina, Hesed, Givurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut, and then we have just many, 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 many connections that can exist between them. And I'm going to describe now one of the connections, the most important connection between them, by which the Star of David actually explains the entire reality. So what is the Star of David really? And keeping in mind that it's Hindu, it's not Jewish, right? Supposedly. And the Jews did not adopt this. We know that the Jewish religion came out of the inner spiritual processes that Kabbalists were doing. And there came a time when they decided to conceal the wisdom of Kabbalah, the actual inner work, meaning what we just described, the ways by which you would burst out of this reality slowly and gradually, like the dear old dad coming out of the hospital. And you would gradually start revealing for yourself spiritual things, an upper world more powerful than the one we're feeling now. This process became impossible for people. So there came a certain time in history when no one was going to be able to do that anyway. How do we know? Because the way that everything shatters into this time-space continuum, whereby all the planets and people are all separated, and then things are also separated across time. We know, Kabbalists know, just like physicists know, that if they go to a particle accelerator and they jam this particle against that particle at 1,000,000 miles an hour, they know that X, Y, and Z explosions will occur, and you could scientifically say what would actually come out molecularly. You could say it if you had all the data. So Kabbalists also know that at certain times, in certain places, this explosion will yield certain particles, which they look at us as a particle, a unit of matter, a unit of spiritual matter clothed in this monkey body. And different ones of different coarseness, meaning different, just like on the periodic table, you have different weights, and it's categorized by the atomic weight. So at different times, different ones will appear. And a time came when nobody, almost nobody, would be able to do what we just described, meaning start coming out of this shell where we feel our world, this sad, sad world, and gradually start awakening themselves, awakening the extra parts of their soul, not extra, the central parts of their soul, in which vessels they would feel and sense the spiritual world, the creator, which is the goal of creation. They knew that couldn't happen, and so they concealed the wisdom of Kabbalah. And what they left people with were certain symbols of the inner processes that you would do to reveal that spiritual world. So there was a way that you would move your heart like this or like that, and then some force would come. So then, according to that, I could design some kind of activity that would serve sort of like you awaken your sleeping leg. Okay, when your leg falls asleep and you need to wake it up, hurts a little bit as the blood flows through it again. So similarly, they designed certain, here you need specific stuff. With your sleeping leg, you can just move it around a little bit, right? With the father who lost his memory, maybe you need to take him to very specific places to remind him, to evoke. You just need to evoke all kinds of things around what you're trying to get at, which is that you are one family and you love each other. Here, Kabbalists created things that, like the grandfather going to Santa Cruz, taking my dad to the boardwalk there, there are things that are specific to your soul, that if you can't engage in the wisdom of Kabbalah, you can't engage in the direct things that we discuss in our KabU courses. We get very scientific about how you study together with a group of people who are on the same path, and you use this as a particle accelerator, a way to burst out of this apple core that we're in, this radish that we're locked inside of, and how you use it as a system, because we are in a system. Okay, everything, it turns out to be scientific and not random. So, but if you couldn't let people work like that because they won't be able to, because of the time, then you could give, nevertheless, I still take my grandpa, I still take my dad home. I want to be with him in whatever capacity, even at the lowest level where he's not even aware of who I am yet. I still want to be with him. So too, Kabbalists designed activities that would somehow parallel the interactions that you would do. And this is what turned into religion. And then affixed to that, affixed to the religion, eventually you got the Star of David, right? No one knows how. I don't know who would be able to really tell you how this started getting incorporated into Judaism. But I suppose it has to do with the timeline that we said before, that it emerged sort of in medieval times. Well, at that time, the head of a community, though the community was just religious, but the head of a community would often be Jewish, not always. The head of the external community would certainly be Jewish, but also a Kabbalist. So there were Kabbalists who were Jews and Kabbalists that weren't Jews, but in a Jewish community, there would often be someone who would both perform regular duties, but also internally, secretly, studied the wisdom of Kabbalah, and maybe had one or two students in secret who were special souls that were, and you just needed to be really inclined to revealing the creator, and there was just no one. There was barely anybody, one or two in the generation. And why am I telling you this? Because from them probably came the sudden attachment of this symbol to the religion as well. Now, what does the symbol actually mean? When is he going to finally explain? Okay, so it has to do with the Sefirot. And this is actually pretty advanced Kabbalah, but I'll try to explain it simply, just to give your money's worth as far as talking about the Star of David. So you have Keter, Chokmah, Bina, Zeranpin, Malchut. When you have Keter, and again, this is going to be very confusing if you don't study with us. If you want to learn the background of this, I suggest signing up for a KabU course. You'll also get access to, after this session, we'll have a face-to-face Zoom where you can ask specific questions live. But I would recommend taking our Blueprint of Creation course, and that one is by me, and I explain the whole structure, the whole plan of creation from beginning to end in a short way that basically boils down all of the writings of the Ari, because this was done so by Bala Sulam in something called the Preface to the Wisdom of Kabbalah, and he really gives us this E equals MC squared of the entire reality, including everything and everything. But I'll give you a little taste of that right now. So you have Sefirot, the first of which is Keter. Keter, and we're talking about a reality here where it's not your life, there's no animals, people, planets, nothing. We're talking about a pre-matter reality. And you have from above the creation, implementation of the plan of creation from the side of the creator without us being involved yet. And so you have this first Sefirah that is called Keter. There are going to be 5 Sefirot. It gives birth to the next phase called Chokmah. To do that, Keter can't just give birth. I can't give birth to something that is not inside of me. So you can't have a genius student that is coming out of a moron teacher. Okay? You will never have, no matter what they think, and they can do whatever they want with statistics, but you will never have Hamlet born out of monkeys typing on a typewriter. no matter how long you go. Okay, so something cannot come from that which does not contain that. Okay, so the keter has to contain, it can't do it yet. It can't give birth to Hokmah. Like also the most obvious example, the mom can't give birth to the baby unless first containing that baby and then all of the genome, the genes behind what made that baby. It has to exist somehow in the giver, in the creator. So in order to give birth to, I promise we'll get to the Star of David here in a minute. In order to give birth to Hokmah, Keter has to contain Hokmah and then can give birth to Hokmah. Now we need to give birth to Bina. The next Sefirah has to come out of Hokmah. So this is how the Sefirot come. Remember I told you there are all kinds of connections between the Sefirot. There's lines connecting them together in all which kind of ways. But this is the most linear way that we can describe. It's a very important discernment here, that Bina cannot be born from Hokmah until Hokmah contains Bina, right? But Hokmah cannot contain Bina yet unless the upper one, the upper to Bina, contains Bina. Okay? And so once Keter, this line is Keter, this line is Hokmah, and this line is Bina. So once this Sefirah of Keter contains Keter, Hokmah, Bina, so then Hokmah below can also contain Bina, and then it can, out of its womb, so to speak, give birth to Bina. Now you see already a triangle. Okay, and this is going to continue. We need to give birth to Tiferet from Bina, or Zeranpin. So we need to give birth to Tiferet, and so the one upper to it must contain it, like a mother has the baby inside of it first and then gives birth to it. Similarly, we can't do that until Hokmah has all three, and then we can't do that until Keter has all of the Sefirot. And finally, we give birth to the last Sefirah. Remember I said we could say there's only 5 Sefirot, right? Keter, Hokmah, Bina, Tiferet, and Malchut. And there's a way that it becomes 10 because the Tiferet contains the rest of them. But for brevity, we just go with these 5. Okay? And so now the same process occurs. So Tiferet needs to give birth to Malchut. But for that to happen, Tiferet needs to contain, have in her Malchut as well. For that to happen, Bina has to have Malchut in her. For that to happen, Hokmah has to have Malchut in her. And for that to happen, Keter, of course, needs to have Malchut. Then you have the entire triangle. Okay? So this here is called the upper triangle. And it doesn't matter what you'll explain with history, and they can find all of the documents that they want, and that it was the Hindus that had it first. So it seems, with what we've revealed so far, it seems that the Hindus had it first, and it seems that the Jews adopted this only later. They liked it for some reason. But at the end of the day, it will be revealed that this is its origin. Though it did not emerge until later, in an obvious way in Jewish culture, and we don't know about Kabbalistic culture. Maybe that first, Kabbalists describe that first book that we looked at, which is the book of Adam HaRishon, called the Secret Angel, Raziel HaMalak. So there you had this star, because this star is a simple way that Kabbalists could communicate to each other. I know I haven't gotten to the full star yet. This is a way that Kabbalists could communicate to each other the whole plan of creation. Okay, now this upper triangle, okay, I won't confuse you with that, but this upper triangle explains one half of creation. This is the way that the creator relates to the creature. This is the way that the lights come down and create sort of, I know it's confusing, like what the heck did he just even describe? But these, again, are very close to us. And that's why if you haven't checked out yet and you actually listened, so you probably have a point in the heart that I like to call it a BS detector, that you can go from place to place and they can say very interesting philosophical, psychological, methodical things. But if it doesn't relate to the truth, that reality beyond ours that we talked about, that we're really in and we're just a few inner motions away from discovering, if it doesn't relate to that, then you feel like you should leave there and keep looking. And even though they had better, maybe ontological arguments in some other place, and it made more logical sense, when you hear these things about the Sefirot, like Bala Sulam says, about the spiritual objects that surround your soul, you still feel like this is your home. Nonplussed as you might be, it still feels like, yeah, but that's the truth. I don't know why, but that's the truth. Okay, so you'll gradually, and maybe we'll do another Kabbalah Explained Simply where we talk about like the origins of things and how they can get confused and ascribed to the wrong people. Maybe they're looking at the wrong evidence. Maybe they're just doing a lot of guesswork, which can be very plausible. But this is what Kabbalah says about the Star of David. You have the upper triangle. And then the most important thing is the lower triangle. The lower triangle is the same process. So what we just gave you was a certain order, and it's pretty easy peasy. Like I said, in the Blueprint of Creation course, we go through this in a more emotional way from beginning to end. And it's pretty short, actually, relatively, considering that you're covering the entire plan of creation. I think it's like 10 to 15 minute sessions. You'll have it. But that's the upper triangle is kind of the easy part. We can really explain it. And we make it really logical in that Blueprint of Creation course. The lower triangle, this is the problem, because where in the description of lights and vessels, that's all there is in reality. Lights and vessels, which I just described to you here, I described to you the vessels in which the lights can be felt. What are lights? Pleasure. Which pleasure? Whichever one you want, whichever one you happen to want, the ones that you will want when you go through this process and discover essentially all of the presents that are under the tree, all of the presents that are awaiting us in the plan of creation. They're pre-designed by the Creator. He created the deficiency, the vessel, the taste for cognac, the taste for going to Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. He created all of the things that you can want, and we follow this trajectory described in this triangle. We follow this trajectory of vessels, which don't look tasty to us right now, but later we'll see that they're so juicy. They're called Sefirot. We follow this trajectory through this entire plan of creation, which is the reception of the lights. Now, when it comes to repeating this process from below upwards, this is the challenge. Okay, this is the whole wisdom of Kabbalah. It's our response, that from which you get this upper triangle and lower triangle. So our response, meaning from above, the Creator did everything. And then how do we respond? Okay, I will check here and see if there are any quick questions that I can answer, and then I'll get to the rest of your questions in the exclusive session in Zoom. So Cointa, hello again. Why do we need to know the true meaning of the spiritual code today and not to confuse it with other teachings? Well, as you could see, I did a lot to confuse you because it doesn't matter if we're confused, and that's why I said I wouldn't fight the battle of whether the book of Adam HaRishon was written in the medieval times or more than 5,000, almost 6,000 years ago. That doesn't matter to me. And whether this star that we're looking at is actually, because the way it was used in history, when we find this evidence, we'll find out that it was actually just a really useful shield. It wasn't like the shield that I showed you here, where it's, a circle with a star as a symbol because this symbol was important to them. Rather, the star itself was the shield, and it just happened to cover the body in a useful way. And you had the main organs protected with a double protection. And that was actually how it was used. It also happens to be the case that that's just incidental to the inner meaning, which is that it's the geometric representation of the entire plan of creation, the way that it comes down from above, from the Creator, and we have to formulate our response, meaning He brought us down into this world where we're in this dark reality, but apparently He set up all of these presents for us to discover, and we need to see how to discover them. And this lower triangle is the way that we do it, by the same pathways. Obviously, I didn't give you the code really for how we discover it from below upward, because that's really the only thing there is to do. That's advanced Kabbalah. That's what we study for. And it's a very serious study, how I morph myself from someone whose senses can only feel this world to starting to feel spiritual lights, starting to respond to the Creator. That the upper triangle is how He bestows onto us, and the lower triangle is how we bestow back onto Him. So with that, we'll conclude. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.